Picture this. Africa's most significant and only continental development bank, the African Development Bank, or the AFDB for short, is at the center of a major global power struggle. But the fight isn't happening on the streets or in parliament. It is unfolding in boardrooms, in the shadows of diplomatic channels, and through economic blackmail. At stake is not just the bank's independence, but Africa's ability to chart its own development path. Here's a shocking fact. Africans don't entirely own the African Development Bank. You heard that right. The United States, which has opposed Africans' independence movements for decades, is the second largest shareholder in the bank. And it gets worse. They're actively trying to control it. The AFDB is being strangled by the very nations that claim to support its mission, and leading the assault is none other than the United States, with its powerful allies in Europe and elsewhere who have fought tooth and nail to ensure Africa remains tied to a neo-colonial agenda. This isn't just a story about a bank, it's about who controls Africa's destiny. So, how did we get here? Why do foreign powers control the African Development Bank? And what does this mean for the continent's future? By the end of this video, you'll realize just how high the stakes are and how it all connects to you. To understand the present, we need to go back to the start. The African Development Bank was established in 1964 as a direct response to the economic exploitation of Africa during the colonial era. The goal was clear: to mobilize resources for the economic and social progress of African nations, fostering self-reliance, sustainability, and growth across the continent. It was meant to be a counterweight to the inequitable global financial systems dominated by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which were and still are heavily skewed towards the interests of Western powers. Back then, Africa was finally shaking off its chains of colonialism. Countries across the continent were finally gaining independence. But there was a caveat. Colonialism left behind economies designed to fail. They built roads, railways, factories, and industries, but ones designed to extract raw materials for Europe, not to build self-reliant, sustainable nations. Recognizing the need for a financial institution tailored to Africa's unique challenges, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere championed the establishment of the AFDB. They knew that true independence wasn't just political, it was economic. Without control over their economies, African nations would remain shackled to the whims of Western powers. But from the very beginning, the AFDB faced challenges. Unlike similar institutions in other regions, such as the European Investment Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, the AFDB didn't have the luxury of robust funding from its member states. Africa's newly independent nations were still grappling with the devastating economic legacies of colonialism, depleted resources, weak infrastructure, and economies structured to disempower local populations. This lack of funding allowed external powers to exert themselves into the AFDB's operations. Today, the African Development Bank is unique among development banks in one alarming way. It heavily depends on non-regional shareholders in foreign countries with no direct stake in Africa's development. The United States, as already mentioned, is the second largest shareholder in the AFDB, right after Nigeria. Other major non-African shareholders are Japan, Germany, and France, who swooped in with their checkbooks. With money comes control. These external powers hold significant voting rights, giving them disproportionate influence over the bank's decisions. Why does this matter? Because these foreign shareholders often have agendas that conflict with Africa's needs. For instance, the United States has repeatedly used its influence to block projects that don't align with its global policies. For example, take Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the AFDB. He's a bold leader who's been pushing Africa to harness its own resources, fossil fuels, renewable energy, investment in infrastructure, you name it. But guess who's not happy about that? Yup, the United States. In 2020, the US took its interference to a whole new level. Washington launched a full-on campaign to remove Adesina from power. The Nigerian economist and former agriculture minister had been championing projects prioritizing Africa's needs over Western interests. Under his leadership, the AFDB had partnered with China to fund energy and infrastructure projects across the continent, projects that challenged Western dominance. To show him who's boss, Stephen Dowd, the US board member at the AFDB, filed a petition accusing him of, wait for it, petty office grievances. I'm not kidding. Claims like favoritism and administrative issues. The allegations were baseless, but they triggered a firestorm. The bank's internal ethics committee investigated and cleared Adesina of all charges. But that wasn't enough for the US Treasury Secretary at the time, Stephen Mnuchin, who demanded a second independent investigation. The matter dragged on for months, creating instability within the bank and damaging its reputation. But guess what? He was cleared again. While the independent panel cleared Adesina of any wrongdoing, the message was clear. The US would significantly undermine any leader who refused to toe the line. So, why all this drama? It wasn't about ethics, but the AFDB's refusal to bow to Washington's dictates. Simply put, Adesina refused to play according to Washington's rules. Now, the AFDB isn't the only African institution under foreign control. It's just one piece of a larger puzzle. Across the continent, African institutions are being manipulated to serve the interests of foreign powers. Take the African Union, for example. On paper, the AU is a symbol of African unity and self-determination. However, in practice, it heavily relies on external funding. Did you know that most of its funding comes from external donors? The European Union, the United States, and China pump millions into the AU's operations. Over 60% of the organization's budget comes from foreign donors. This dependency undermines the AU's ability to pursue a genuinely independent agenda. For instance, the AU's peacekeeping missions like the African Union mission to Somalia often serve the strategic interests of their funders rather than address the root causes of conflict. Similarly, the AU's infrastructure development programs are frequently aligned with the priorities of its largest donors, leaving little room for African-led initiatives. The parallels between the AU and the AFDB are striking. In both cases, Africa's premier institutions are both being held hostage by powers that once colonized it or have dominated it since independence. It's a vicious cycle. Africa's lack of financial resources forces it to seek external funding, but that funding comes with conditions that perpetuate dependency and undermine sovereignty. Another glaring example is Washington's opposition to fossil fuel projects in Africa. Africa produces oil, natural gas, and coal, exports them to the West, and then buys back expensive refined products. Sound familiar? It's the same exploitative system that existed under colonialism. Adesina and the AFDB have been trying to break this cycle by funding energy projects that utilize Africa's own resources. However, the US has been blocking these efforts under the pretext of fighting climate change. Now, don't get me wrong, green energy is the future. But why is Africa being forced to skip steps in its development while the US and Europe are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels? By blocking Africa from exploiting its cheap and abundant energy reserves, the US ensures that the continent remains dependent on expensive imports while limiting its industrialization potential. And that, my friends, is the real agenda. When your funding comes from outsiders, your agenda stops being your own. We need to look at the bigger picture to grasp the real stakes. The battle over the AFDB is part of a broader struggle in an increasingly multipolar world. Africa has become a key battleground in this global competition, with its vast resources and growing markets. The US, in particular, has been waging an economic and political war in Africa to regain the influence it lost to China over the last 2 decades. The AFDB, under Adesina's leadership, has sought to end the vicious cycle. By prioritizing infrastructure development, energy projects, and agricultural initiatives, the bank has tried to address Africa's most pressing needs. For example, the AFDB has strongly advocated for the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, a pan-African initiative to create a single market for goods and services across the continent. The AfCFTA has the potential to transform Africa's economy, but it has faced significant hurdles, including resistance from foreign powers that benefit from Africa's fragmented markets. The AFDB, like the African Union, was born out of a vision of freedom, self-determination, and unity. Yet, decades later, these institutions remain shackled by the forces they were meant to resist. Our revolutionary forefathers knew the dangers of foreign interference and warned against them. But decades later, we are still battling the same forces, only now they wear suits and sit on the boards of our institutions. Whether it's the AFDB, the AU, our resources, or our future, it's all connected. Foreign powers don't want an Africa that can stand on its own. They want an Africa that plays by their rules, an Africa that serves as a market for their products and a source of cheap labor and raw materials. But here is the kicker: Africa has the power to change this. The 54 countries that comprise the AFDB could pool their resources, buy back foreign shares, and take complete control of the bank. But it requires unity, a pan-African approach prioritizing the continent's collective interests over individual political gains. The battle for the African Development Bank is more than just a fight over policy. It's a fight for Africa's future. It's a fight for economic sovereignty, the right to determine our destiny, and the dream of a united, self-reliant continent. We have the resources, the talent, and the willpower to build a brighter future. We need the courage to stand up to external interference and reclaim our own institutions. Let's be our own piper, play our own tune, and lead ourselves to our own future.